So we have a Pips eating in the background over there. And if you look closely, you'll see that he often enjoys pulling the food out of the bowl, putting it on the floor, and then eating it off the floor. He's not doing it right now, but he'll do it probably before this video is over. So you thought the Dear Authors series was done. No. It's still happening. I have many series that are still happening, including ones I have not added an entry to in over a year. Trust me, I'm just very good at, procrastinating. But here and today, we are adding another entry into the Dear Authors series. I need to get on into this. Let's just get on into it. Oh, you can't see him eat. He moved to the side. Too bad. Atmosphere is one of the most difficult things to capture in storytelling, I believe. I think it's a lot easier in visual mediums because you have a lot more ways to communicate the atmosphere you're trying to establish to the viewer. Obviously, there's basically the entire art of cinematography, which is structured around capturing atmosphere in many ways, not entirely, but largely that's what it's doing. And even in audio formats, you have the voice of the narrator or sound effects and music, which can aid you. But authors have to craft an atmosphere, and they can only use their words and your interpretation in their head. Not exactly an exact science. It's why when I do review books, I don't even often mention it, because so few authors nail it that I'm not going to mark down people who don't manage to craft an atmosphere, because I don't feel like it's fair, because maybe it would work for others. I've had certain books where I felt like there was a great atmosphere and other people told me there was like none, like Gentleman Bastards. I've seen people not even mention the Gentleman Bastards atmosphere in their reviews when I think it's one of the most standout things from the series. And then flip that around, a lot of people think that Kingkiller has a wonderful atmosphere. I really don't. So while almost nothing in a review is completely objective, I find atmosphere to be one of the most subjective things that you can bring up in a review. But when it's stellar, it pretty much can make a book. I think a great atmosphere can help carry even a mediocre story to almost great levels. But when it comes to someone who has mastered atmosphere and storytelling, you can result in someone like Stephen King, someone whose every single book, every page feels like the Stephen King multiverse, because he knows how to make a consistent atmosphere. Even when he's not telling a horror story, you can still tell it's one of his books taking place within these worlds. And there are many things that come together to craft the aura of the story. It's the authorial voice, it's the world building, it's the character actions, the consistency of character. All these things come together, and it's a really hard pyramid to manage. The foundations are shifty at best, especially if you are inconsistent with how you present them to the reader. So it's extraordinarily difficult to bring to its full potential. And while it's that difficult to even build, it's so easy to break. As I mentioned, inconsistency with things like character or world can utterly destroy it. And that's why certain genres do have a bit of an advantage. Horror stories, for example, typically go one route. They're gonna have this kind of tone and atmosphere going forward. Done. Romance novels, also a bit easier, but genres that are a bit more flexible with their overall approach, it can be very hard. Fantasy, for example, there's been some fantasy books I've read which have either a poorly constructed atmosphere or almost none entirely. And again, it doesn't completely break the book to not have atmosphere, but I would say it does prevent it from reaching the truly great heights. I want to make sure I'm conveying what I mean by atmosphere as clearly as possible, because I feel like this is the most mushy subject I've ever talked about in one of these Dear Authors videos. The atmosphere is the feeling of the world the author is immersing you in. All of the elements of world building and constructing the environment you are experiencing really craft the atmosphere of this story. The way the characters interact with the world, interact with each other, the way the story even develops can all attribute to this. For example, a world-building element that can really lend to atmosphere, I'd like to contrast the way that the general populace is conveyed in a Brandon Sanderson story versus a Gentleman Bastard story. Brandon Sanderson and Scott Lynch both know how to build an atmosphere incredibly well. Brandon, he's usually a little bit lighter. You don't feel dark and depressed while reading his worlds. So the average person you come across is generally kind of friendly. Some of the characters are evil for sure, and some people are jerks, but on average, most people seem to be good, hardworking people. Turn that around for Scott Lynch within the Gentleman Bastards series. While the entire Cosmere has maybe more of a positive note with how people treat each other, Gentleman Bastards Pretty much every interaction with strangers has some kind of tainting bad element. Either the person is described as dirty or starving, poor, or they're mean and a jerk. The nobility tend to be kind of horrible people, while the wealthier upper class, and this all comes together to let you know what kind of world you're living in. Scott Lynch then turns that around and has a juxtaposition of incredibly funny, lighthearted characters, but he pulls that off perfectly, and it actually makes the atmosphere a tribute to everything even better. That's why I keep praising it within that story. It's this great juxtaposition of the dark, dingy world with the crass, over-the-top, ludicrous characters who are at the center. Beautiful. But even outside of the world building, the way your actual characters, not just the general people, but your heart of the story characters behave and who we're following can again shift what the atmosphere feels like. Again, let's pull from these same two authors. Kaladin, Dalinar, Shallan all have pretty messed up things in their past. They're all dark in some way, but following them is not the horrific, depressing thing. There's often feelings and vibes of hope, and at the end of this day, you know they're striving for good. Again, let's look at the main characters for Gentlemen Bastards. Two guys who on surface value are very happy-go-lucky, funny people, but their ends aren't exactly pure, and the world they're in is so dirty that certainly the dirt gets on them. And especially the star of the story, Locke, is someone who has this simmering feeling of darkness just underneath the surface. We're never really sure how dark Locke is willing to go. He has this bubbly exterior of happy, joking facade, but he does some pretty dark things throughout the story and doesn't show a whole lot of remorse. And that brings me to really the X factor when it comes to constructing atmosphere. Honestly, you can pull off pretty much everything I've mentioned nearly perfectly and have a consistent, well-built world with people who act and behave consistently, characters who are constructed well and deep so that the reader will understand who they are. But if you are not technically a good enough writer who has a strong authorial voice, again, this could all fall apart. This comes down to a little bit of just technical writing skill and a little bit of just an X-factor personality coming through. Obviously not to a too great extent. It's not good to have such a strong personality bleed through that it just overrides your story. I think Stephen King has even rid that line really closely a couple times, but he's never quite gone over. But you need to just understand your ability as a writer and what sounds good and comes across well to the reader to really pull off this final X factor. It's just a pure skill of the author type situation. And I think it's one that outside of just very rare circumstances is born through experience. I very rarely see someone who on their first ever entry has just built a perfect world because they understand what will sound good to the reader and what's going to help build their atmosphere and move on. Elantris was Brandon Sanderson's first published book, and that one manages to have a good atmosphere. But there's a word there that adds a caveat. Published book. First published book. I don't know if it was the first he wrote, and I don't know if it was the first one he got feedback from friends, family, etc., etc. But I doubt the first finished story Brandon put together had nearly as well a crafted environment for the reader to sit in that Elantris does. But even then, what he writes now is so much greater in immersing the reader in the story than I think Elantris first provided. I'm not hating on Elantris. Elantris is great. But think about how much you feel the world around you as a reader, diving deep into Stormlight Archive or Mistborn compared to Elantris. Rather different, and that's because I think he's improved as an author. And I'm afraid some people are still going to confuse what I'm saying here for just world building. You can have an incredibly well-built world that just feels dry and builds no atmosphere. I will get some hate for saying this, but it is a bit of a personal preference thing, but I find The Lord of the Rings to lack atmosphere compared to a lot of the contemporary greats just because of the writing styles of the time and how they've changed. And Lord of the Rings has pretty much without a doubt the best built fantasy world in history with the amount of just crazy detail Tolkien kept adding with letters, the Silmarillion, and things before he died. But I don't find the atmosphere to be as present as a lot of modern stories, which do focus a lot more on bringing the reader and placing them in the story rather than just telling them a story and telling them almost just facts about the world. Again, personal preference. I love Lord of the Rings. I think it's one of the greatest things ever written by a human, but I don't find the atmosphere to be one of those things that makes it so great. I think it's good, just not up to the standard that the greats are setting now because of the evolution of writing styles and authors realizing what people enjoy reading more. Now, if you notice, this is a bit different from my other Dear Author videos because I don't know how to tell people how to do this better. I'm writing right now and I'm struggling to craft an atmosphere because while I know the elements that go into the recipe that could result in a good atmosphere. It's the actual baking process, let's continue this metaphor, that I'm still a little bit gray on. And I'd love to hear your input in the comments down below. What do you find to be really something that can make or break an atmosphere for you as a reader? I'm fascinated to know the responses. Is it a lot of attention paid to the world building, or more focus on how the characters interact with the world? Maybe histories and a fully fleshed out kind of mythology around what's being told to you? Let me know in the comments down below. What immerses you in the story the most? Like and subscribe if you have not already, guys. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here on my channel, and let me know what Dear Author video you'd like to see next. Have a good one, y'all. Peace!